Hi folks, welcome back. I'm Dennis Vitoza, also known as Jeff Noodles, and today we're going to be talking about The Odyssey. Yes, you guessed it, our favorite topic of the week, maybe even the month at this point. There is just so much happening with this movie that it feels like every day there's another story, another controversy, another reaction, or another debate surrounding it, and today is no different, obviously. The reviews are in, and as we covered earlier, the audience reviews are allegedly being blotted, but that's not the only thing worth looking at. The critics' reviews are also out, and the online commentators have been weighing in as well. They have a lot of opinions about this film. Some of those opinions are genuinely surprising, while others are pretty much exactly what you would expect. Either way, they've added an entirely new layer to the conversation, and there are a few of them that I think are especially worth breaking down. So today, we're going to look at several of those reactions, including Ben Shapiro's review, Emily Wilson's thoughts. Emily Wilson, by the way, being one of the translators whose work served as a basis for Nolan's adaptation, as well as The View's brilliant commentary on the film. We'll also take a look at Elon Musk, who decided to throw his own 2 cents in to the conversation. So all that being said, let's start out with Ben Shapiro's review. Here it is.
It doesn't take me out of the film that there's a multiracial cast. If you want to make the case everybody needs to be Greek to be authentic, I think you can make that case. If you want to make the case everybody has to be white, I think that is a lesser case because white people and Greek are not quite the same thing.
One thing that will never cease to amaze me is whenever Ben Shapiro decides to do commentary on race and starts deciding who's white and who's not, it always seems to default into this really strange worldview that ironically mirrors the same kind of racialist framework he spent years criticizing. It becomes this question of who is deserving of the mantle of being truly white or European, and Ben Shapiro always seems to be either defending or rejecting that label depending on how it fits the particular narrative he's trying to advance. It always ends up feeling incredibly arbitrary with this guy. Ben Shapiro, who famously went on Jubilee, by the way, about a year ago and said that he does not consider himself white, even though, as he put it, the pigment of his skin is white. He argued that because he's Jewish, he doesn't identify as white. Look, at the end of the day, that's entirely up to him. He can define himself however he wants. If the distinction Ben is trying to make is that whiteness is something specifically tied to Western Europe ancestry rather than simply skin color, then I can at least understand the argument he's attempting to make. But it becomes bizarre once you start applying that framework consistently because objectively, Greeks look white. If we're simply talking about how people are perceived based on appearance, which is how race is typically understood in everyday life, then Greeks are generally perceived as white. Now, even if we adopt Ben's apparent Western framework for a moment, where exactly does that leave everyone else? What does that mean about Eastern Europeans, Ukrainians, Russians? Are they white? Who gets to decide? Who is drawing these lines? It quickly becomes a completely useless conversation because the definitions constantly shift depending on who's making the argument. It would simplify things tremendously if when people say race, they simply refer to broad physical appearance, the way people are generally perceived in everyday life. If Ben Shapiro walked down the street without a yarmulke, which granted, I don't know if he ever does that, most people wouldn't identify him as Jewish. They'd simply see a white guy that has some really thick eyebrows. Yet, in Ben's framework, there's apparently some additional quality attached to whiteness that Greeks simply don't possess. Now, being as charitable as possible, if we want to understand Ben's argument historically, the exclusion of Greeks from the so-called white category has its roots in historically shifting definitions of race and in Greeks' unique position within the Mediterranean. And to understand Ben Shapiro's framework, we actually have to step into the very intersectional concepts, racialized concepts that conservatives have often criticized. So effectively, in order to explain a definition of race that goes beyond biology or immediate physical appearance, we have to talk about race as a social construct. That's an idea rooted primarily in critical race theory and broader theories of social constructionism. Now, from a philosophical perspective, this falls under social ontology, which studies how societies create, maintain, and reinforce categories that people then begin treating as if they're objectively real. Within that broader framework, there are several approaches. Political constructionism views race as a socially created hierarchy designed to organize and subordinate populations based on physical characteristics. Cultural constructionism emphasizes that racial groups develop shared identities and distinct cultures in response to historical experiences and marginalization. Then there's social ontological nominalism, which argues that many of the categories humans use don't inherently exist in nature, but are instead intellectual or linguistic conventions that societies create in order to organize reality. Now, as we discussed a few days ago, nominalism is one of the philosophical foundations behind much of modern postmodernism and deconstructionism. The idea that categories themselves are socially constructed and therefore flexible. At its most extreme, this reasoning is often extended to concepts like gender. Ironically, that part of what Ben Shapiro seems to be doing here. Rather than relying purely on observable biological characteristics, he's adopting a definition of race that depends on historical and social classifications instead. Now, applying that framework specifically to Greeks only reinforces the point. Race, if understood as a social construct, changes over time and varies depending on where you are. In the United States, for example, during the late 19th and early 20th century, Anglo-Saxon Protestant identity occupied the dominant social position. And thus, during the massive waves of immigration, Greeks, along with Italians and the Irish, were frequently stereotyped, marginalized, and excluded from the dominant white social class, despite generally being legally classified as white. So in that sense, Ben Shapiro appears to be appealing to a historical framework that originated during one of the most exclusionary periods in American history, when Southern and Eastern Europeans were often treated as racially inferior by the Anglo-Saxon establishments, which, by the way, Ben Shapiro is not a part of, to his own admission, right? Now, further, geographically, Greece also occupies a unique position at the crossroads of Europe, Asia, and Africa. Centuries of migration, trade, and Mediterranean geography have contributed to a population with tremendous diversity in appearance. Many Greeks have olive skin, darker complexions, and craniofacial features that differ somewhat from populations in Northern and Western Europe. Because of this, some scholars argue that Greeks have stronger genetic and phenotypic connections with populations in the Levant, Anatolia, and other parts of the Eastern Mediterranean than with Anglo-Saxon populations in Northern Europe. But again, that only brings us back to the same unanswered question. What definition of white is Ben Shapiro actually using? He never truly provides any sort of explanation, not in this clip that we just watched. So is he relying on the old WASP definition of whiteness? Because today, whether Greeks are considered white depends almost entirely on which racial framework someone adopts. Throughout Europe and in most of the world, Greeks are broadly considered white Europeans. In the United States, however, where whiteness has historically been associated with Northern and Western European heritage, some people still distinguish Mediterranean populations from the traditional Anglo-Saxon conception of whiteness. And that appears to be the framework that Ben Shapiro is drawing from. Now, to me, though, this ultimately just feels like another way of dividing people. Ben Shapiro doesn't even consider himself white, yet he's simultaneously drawing lines around who else qualifies as white and who doesn't. Based on what standard exactly, brother? It opens up far more questions than it actually answers. Now, what's especially interesting is the conversation surrounding the Odyssey and the casting choices. As we saw in this clip, Ben Shapiro doesn't seem to care very much about the multiracial cast, and that has, to a certain effect, created tension within conservative circles. Ben isn't the only one making these kinds of multiracial arguments, these pro-multiracial arguments, which are relatively new in conservative circles in the last decade. You wouldn't be making an argument like this 5 years ago. However, other people in the Daily Wire, like Andrew Klavan, has made similar comments. Meanwhile, Matt Walsh has pushed back with a different view, and the three of them have gotten into somewhat of a light back and forth on X about it. At the same time, many conservatives have been trying to soften their rhetoric in response to broader cultural debates surrounding identity politics. Ben Shapiro, as we saw here, even praised The Odyssey in several respects, saying that he enjoyed aspects of the filmmaking and that the multiracial casting didn't particularly bother him. And while notable, that's not really surprising. We're talking about the same Ben Shapiro who said he doesn't care about the browning of America while also supporting mass deportations during Trump's 2024 presidential campaign. Whether you see those positions as contradictory or not, they certainly raise questions about how consistent his broader political, philosophical framework truly are. Now, all that being said, next up, we have a clip from Emily Wilson, whose translation of The Odyssey served as one of the primary inspirations for Christopher Nolan's adaptation.
What did you think about the film in terms of this notion of The Odyssey as an anti-war text?
Mm-hmm. I mean, I thought I want to, not spoil anything about the film, because I know the majority of people haven't seen the film. The film has these flashbacks to the Trojan War. I'm not sure if I see it as an entirely anti-war film, but it certainly presents us with an Odysseus who feels very bad about certain things that he's done in war and is struggling to process them in a very, I would say, very modern psychiatrized way. And he's struggling to process them and needs drugs to do so for help with his recovery.
Right.
And he seems to feel bad about being a warrior, and we never actually get to see him doing much warrioring, which I thought in a way was a bit of a shame. I mean, we do get to see the boat, which is lovely, but I think in some ways, I mean, I was realizing, thinking about the film, there's a tolerance for ambiguity in the world of the Odyssey, which I don't think there exactly is in the world of Hollywood blockbuster action films.
Right.
And I think that's one of the big challenges for Nolan, right?
Yeah.
Is that he has to make the protagonist a likable all-American hero,
right?
Which is a real challenge if you're basing this on a poem where the hero is not necessarily motivated by romantic love or being a nice suburban parent, but actually he wants glory, and he wants to get spoils from the sack of a city, which is, you'll see what Nolan does with all of that, but it's different things from what Homer does.
Right.
I kept looking in vain for a sense that this was a film about glory. I think it's a film that has some interest in shame, but I don't think it has any interest in glory.
So let me see if I get this straight. Emily Wilson is basically saying she wanted more action. She's essentially saying, wait a second, Nolan, you took all the action out. Instead of focusing on Odysseus as a legendary warrior, the movie apparently spends much more time with him wrestling with his own guilt and shame. Are we serious? What is Nolan doing? What's confusing is that I keep hearing completely different descriptions of this movie. 1 minute, I'm told it's basically one giant action spectacle, and then the next I'm hearing criticism that it actually doesn't have enough action. Which is it? Because those are two completely different movies. The reactions seem all over the place, and it's becoming increasingly difficult to figure out what Nolan actually made, especially because I haven't watched the movie, don't really care to watch it. Anyway, Wilson even describes it as a modern psychiatric revision of the character. What does that even mean? Honestly, that sounds like one of the least appealing directions you could take with The Odyssey. Instead of watching one of history's greatest heroes overcome impossible odds, we're watching a guy endlessly struggle with a psychological burden of being a warrior. The whole movie is just a giant struggle session. Really? Why? Since when did every heroic story have to become a therapy session? Can we just go back to telling stories that celebrate bravery, celebrate heroism? Can we go back to a culture that doesn't constantly frame strength, courage, and sacrifice as something to be ashamed of? Sometimes people do have typical jobs to do. Sometimes they have to fight. Sometimes they have to accomplish great things under impossible circumstances. Not every story has to reinterpret heroism through the lens of guilt and self-loathing. Can we please just go back to a society that values honor? Anyway, folks, that being said, The View also had an opinion on this movie, and this was going to come full circle, folks. Here it is.
Apparently, conservative critics are losing their minds over the cast of the Christopher Nolan epic, The Odyssey.
Who said that?
They were doing that even before it came out, but now that it's #1 at the box office, some of them are still trashing the movie, but others, like radio host and podcaster Ben Shapiro, are giving credit where credit is due. Watch.
As a director, Nolan is unparalleled. He's the best director working today, without a doubt. He just creates iconic movie after iconic movie. I know a lot of people were like, oh my God, Lupita Nyong'o is supposed to look like Diane Kruger. I don't know, Diane Kruger doesn't look very Greek. She's German. So Lupita Nyong'o is a beautiful woman. There are a lot of conservatives who are getting whipped up about the film because it is stupid to cast Elliot Page as a dude. It's just stupid. But people on the right were saying, oh, the movie's going to bomb because of that. No, the movie's not going to bomb because of that. It turns out that when people want to be entertained, they're willing to entertain even bad flaws in the tooth if it turns out that the smile is nice.
Listen, a lot of conservatives who see this are going to feel the same way. That's okay. But I don't understand. If you feel like, why go see the movie? If you don't want to see it, then don't go see it. Why do you care who's casting
go see it.
I don't understand this idea that if we hate it, everybody must hate it because we hate it for this reason. You don't like Elliot Page, don't go see the damn movie. Don't do it. Yeah. We will be okay if you don't go see it.
Yeah. Twitter is not real life. So there was this huge.
Say that again.
Twitter is not real life.
Only 20% of the country
is even on
Twitter, and out of the 20% on Twitter, 80 of the Twitter trolls, 80% are the most active.
And
so it's just a big.
I swear, watching this, you would think this is one of the worst films ever made. Newsflash, it is a masterpiece. This is a phenomenal film. It's blown records out. It's made tons of money, 264 million worldwide. But I would also argue this. There's a really good culture writer I like, Juan Carlos Sopo at National Review, and he argues there's a real conservative message. It's about devotion to family. It's about faith. It's about upholding institutions. It's about how war is dangerous and has repercussions for all of us. And the fact that conservatives can't take the win and just be like, oh no, this is a really excellent film with a good message for like families, I'll never understand it.
Is society truly becoming this retarded? Because it seems like every single person has a completely different understanding of this movie. They can't even agree on the basic facts of what it does or what it says or what it represents. You even see that playing out here in real time. One person is saying the movie has a conservative message, and then somebody immediately jumps in and says, no, actually, it's pretty liberal. So which is it? What are we doing here? This is supposed to be a relatively straightforward story about heroism, perseverance, resilience, and the long journey home. Yet, I haven't heard many people talking about those themes at all. Instead, the conversation has become almost entirely political, ideological, or psychological. It's as though nobody can simply engage with the story on its own terms. Now, look, all that being said, I don't want to get ahead of myself here for a second. This movie will probably make a lot of money. I've said that from the beginning. Christopher Nolan is one of the biggest directors alive, and his fan base alone is going to guarantee that this film becomes a major commercial success. Will it be remembered as an instant classic, as these ladies claim here? I don't think so. Will Nolan fans reference it for years and defend it? Absolutely. But once the initial excitement dies down and the hardcore Nolan audience moves on, I don't think this ends up having the staying power that most people expect. Most people like this lady, Alyssa Farrah Griffin. Personally, I still think the 1970s adaptation of The Odyssey is the version that stood the test of time. That's the one I grew up watching, and honestly, once I have my kids, that's the version I'm going to show them, not the Nolan one. Why? Because that movie, the 1970s version, was fun. It understood that adventure stories are supposed to be entertaining. Somewhere along the way over the last few years, we stripped the fun out of storytelling. Everything has to be political. Everything has to carry some ideological message. Everything has to be reinterpreted so it appeals to every demographic, every activist group, every cultural faction. Can we just go back to telling stories? Seriously, can we please go back to telling stories? That's all this is supposed to be. Tell a compelling story. Tell it creatively. It really isn't that complicated when you think about it. And this is also what I find so suspicious. You have people across the political spectrum pushing this movie as though it's some kind of cultural event that's supposed to bring everyone together. I've told you guys before that I have a suspicion, and this is my own interpretation, that Hollywood is increasingly promoting pagan themes at the same time Christianity is seeing renewed interest in the United States. When I look at the coordinated enthusiasm from voices on the left and on the right, it raises questions for me. It's almost as if, for one brief moment, everyone is willing to put the culture war aside and rally around the same cultural product. Whether that's intentional or not, I find it interesting, especially given the broader cultural trends that we've been seeing lately. Now, also interesting is the fact that the ladies of The View are defending Ben Shapiro. That should tell you everything you need to know. Anyway, believe it or not, it only got worse from there.
Stuck on woke.
But there's nothing woke in this film.
There's a unique ignorance to someone who comments on something they've never seen. You're taught from a young age, do your research, learn, and then you can join the conversation. But it's like not voting and then complaining about what you get. Yeah. You cannot not see the film and complain about how awful it is when you haven't seen the film. Because this film, and I echo Alyssa, is a masterpiece. And the best part is, the more intimidating thing when I went to see it was, one, I hated The Odyssey, mainly because it was so hard to read. Yeah. And that eventually loses it. I'm like, never mind, I'll read John Grisham. But so there's that part. And also, anytime they put so many stars in one cast, I sometimes wonder if I'll be able to get sucked in. Minutes in, every one of those actors you think you know disappears. Yeah. And it becomes The Odyssey. It's brilliant.
Yeah. I mean, I don't understand it. You know, I don't get why you have to poop on everything you don't get. I'll tell you that I'm going to keep saying this to you people until you understand it. 90% of America has never been asleep.
Anyway, unsurprisingly, Whoopi immediately pivots into attacking conservatives and the Trump administration. I'm not even exaggerating. You can go watch the rest of the clip yourself if you'd like to torture yourself. She goes on a 30 to 40-second diatribe where she completely goes off the rails, making the usual appeals to workers and repeating the typical left-wing talking points. I find that especially ironic because, the modern left's policies have often worked against the working class despite frequently claiming to represent them and appealing to them constantly. Now, what's really interesting is that you have people who are supposedly on the right, like that illicit chick who was on the screen a moment earlier, attacking wokeness, while other of our co-hosts are making arguments like, you don't get to have an opinion unless you've seen the movie. At the same time, that woman quite literally admits that she hated reading The Odyssey, never actually finished it, and would rather read John Grisham novels. So what are we doing here? You didn't even read Homer's work, yet you're insisting Nolan's adaptation is a masterpiece. I'm the complete opposite, by the way. I read Homer. I think the original was great. In my opinion, I didn't need Nolan to improve it. So how does it make any sense to dismiss the original while elevating the adaptation? Are we really shilling this hard for a horrible movie that we're now saying people should skip Homer because Nolan somehow did it better? And then taking it a step further by arguing that if you've read Homer, but you haven't seen Nolan's film, to have an opinion? What are we doing here? And look, her comparison to voting was even stranger. Somehow the argument became that not watching The Odyssey is like not voting in an election, but that analogy completely falls apart. In this country, people are free to abstain from voting if they choose to, and that doesn't suddenly strip them of their First Amendment rights. Freedom of speech means you're allowed to express your opinion whether someone agrees with it or not, especially when you're already familiar with the original source material. If you've actually read The Odyssey, it's hard to argue that your perspective is somehow invalid simply because you haven't put yourself through 3 hours of Christopher Nolan torture, okay? Honestly, there's so many contradictions packed into those few seconds that the only explanation I can come up with is that these women are objectively retarded and have zero self-awareness. The logic seems to be Homer doesn't count because he's too difficult to read. Nolan is better than Homer, and unless you've seen Nolan's version, you're not allowed to comment, even if you've actually read the original epic. I genuinely struggle to understand how these people can say these things out loud without recognizing how contradictory they sound. Anyway, Elon Musk jumped into the conversation later and posted a couple of tweets that have been making the rounds. First, he shared an AI version of The Odyssey, a short version, a 3-minute version that's already received a tremendous amount of attention. Then he wrote that before the end of the year, Grok Imagine would create a full-length version of The Odyssey that is historically accurate and faithful to the art of Homer. And later, Elon went even further, saying he'd offer Mel Gibson $100 million to remake The Odyssey. Honestly, I'd pay to see that. I love Mel Gibson's work, and I think he'd approach the material with a real commitment to the original story. I think he'd make a film that's genuinely rooted in what Homer wrote rather than producing something that feels like just propaganda that's detached from the source material. Anyway, that's my take. Let me know what you think in the comments down below. If you enjoyed this video, make sure you like and subscribe. Share it with a friend if you think they'd enjoy it as well. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you again tomorrow. Hope you have a wonderful day. Peace.